You are listening to the Hemp Startup Journey. My name is Jason De Los Santos, co-founder of Spectrum Labs, a hemp extraction facility in Asheville, North Carolina. I'm sitting down with hemp entrepreneurs, scientists, and politicians willing to share their perspectives, lessons learned, and how we can make an impact on the hemp and cannabis industry for everyone.
Record here, and then just let me know when you're back on. I can't see your face right now.
Yeah, I decided to use my phone because and so there's a call that came through, so I guess that was the problem.
Sure.
You know what? So I wonder if that's going to be an issue.
If you want to stay on your phone, you're more than welcome to. I would put it on airplane mode and turn on the Wi-Fi.
That's a good idea. Thank you for that. So Wi-Fi is on. I'll put it on airplane for the. Yeah. Okay. How does that look? Is that so you can see me?
Yeah.
Nothing's okay. Great. Perfect. Look at that. Okay. I learned something every day.
just use me, man. I'm your tech guy.
That's right, man. That's my smart client. So. Okay. Well, good. So whenever you're ready, I'm ready to roll.
All right. Good deal. So let's see. We're recording. Okay. Great. Rod, great to see you as always. Thank you for coming on the Hemp Startup Journey again. How are you?
I'm great, Jason. It's really nice to be here. It's always fun talking with you.
Good. So I'm happy to see you. I'm also displeased to see you because of what we're going to talk about today. You have a lot of people up in arms about a couple of recent articles, so I really want to dig into that. And let's see. So just on my agenda here, and tell me if there's anything else that you wanted to go over. But I have three main things. So one is the issue about this is all regarding the DEA and the memo that they put out maybe a week or two ago. And the three main things that stood out to me were about hemp extract that has Delta-9 above 0.3%, and that them claiming that that's an illegal substance. The second one being about synthetic cannabinoids and Delta-8 specifically. So that was another article that you wrote. And then the third, not necessarily on the DEA memo, but just about about North Carolina specifically and the hemp pilot program expiring here in about, I think, 2 months, roughly. So that is scary stuff. So I figure that should be enough, topics.
Right? That's a lot of good juicy stuff to dig into. So yeah, let's talk about all three of those. That's great.
Good. So starting with the first one, and this is really very relevant to me and my team here, being that we're extractors in Asheville. And so you and I talked about this actually the very first time we met, and you talked about the elephant in the room. So can you expand on this whole work in progress hemp extract and what that means, and how the DEA is talking about this in a way that they're saying like, oh, you can't hold this, even if it's for a minute, an hour, a week.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't mind, I'd love to put it in a little bit of context as to what the DEA has done and why. I've written some articles about it, but just for the viewing audience here. So the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, is a federal agency, and federal agencies, by and large, are have jurisdiction to enforce certain statutes. In the case of the DEA, it has jurisdiction to enforce the Controlled Substances Act, which is the statute enacted by Congress back in the early 70s that regulates drug compounds. And we don't have to go into a huge thing about scheduling and whatnot in this podcast, but essentially the DEA regulates and enforces drug laws. And as we know, marijuana is a Schedule 1 drug, which is the most restrictive. There's, according to the statute, there's no medical benefits to it, and it's highly addictive. Neither of which is true, of course, but that's where we stand. Hemp, on the other side, is a form of cannabis that was completely removed from the Controlled Substances Act. It is not a controlled substance. It's not a drug at all. And so these federal agencies will issue rules. The USDA issued an interim final rule back last fall, in which it has the authority to regulate certain aspects of hemp and hemp production. Well, this is the DEA's version, and the DEA says, "Oh, well, we're going to issue our rules about hemp." Well, first and foremost, hemp is not a controlled substance. So what is the DEA doing to begin with? Why is it even inserting itself? But more importantly, it has some problematic issues that we've talked about. And the issue that you've brought up is sort of the hot hemp extract issue. And what the DEA has said is, sure, we acknowledge, as it should, that hemp is lawful. It's not a controlled substance. However, if a hemp extract ever exceeds 0.3% Delta-9 THC, then it is unlawful marijuana, and that's where we come in. That is unlawful, and it's controlled, and without some sort of authority from the DEA, then you're dealing with an illegal controlled substance. I'll stop there. There are a lot of problems with that analysis that I'm happy to jump into.
Yeah, so you wrote an article, and I'll link to that in the show notes if anybody wants to read it, which I think everybody should. So you talk about how the intent, and I think maybe, I hope I'm not paraphrasing it correctly, but the intent of Congress was that there would be processing and that there would be this work in progress hemp, right? Or like this hot hemp. Like, is that how you came to that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, well, Congress, enacted the Farm Bill with these hemp provisions. It was very clear that hemp itself is not a controlled substance. And it went on, it didn't just say hemp and that's it. It went on and it said hemp and all of its extracts, derivatives, isomers, cannabinoids, and so on and so forth. Well, it says extract. And so if you talk about extract, anyone who's been in the business and understands even moderately how it works knows that extraction is where you're pulling the cannabinoids and maybe some other of the goodies out of the hemp flower and the biomass. And what that does, by and large, and maybe almost entirely, is to ramp up the percentages of the cannabinoids without actually increasing the quantity of those cannabinoids. And one of those cannabinoids is Delta-9. And so most any form of processing to create an extract is going to spike the THC levels above 0.3%. In the DEA's eyes, that suddenly transforms it from a legal product to an illegal product, even if that process only occurs very briefly. And to really sort of flesh this out, let's kind of simplify things. Let's talk about the most simple form of processing that exists, which is just trimming up your crop. So let's take the example of a farmer who is licensed by whatever state he or she is in, who grows hemp, has it tested by the appropriate state authorities. The authorities say, yes, this is a lawful hemp plant. It contains no more than 0.3% Delta-9 THC. Great, let's go to harvest it. Farmer goes out to the field and takes that plant, which has been tested typically as a composite, which means that the testing agency will go out and clip usually the top third of the plant, includes the stalk, the fan leaves, the buds, the seeds, everything else that's all in there, takes that, grinds it up, sends it to an analytical lab to test it. Okay, well, great. So the farmer goes out and harvests that crop. Well, let's say the farmer's in the field holding that legal plant and says, well, really, I'm not interested in the stalk or the seeds. That's not what my business is about. And really the leaves don't help that much. They're kind of low in cannabinoids. What I want is this bud, which contains all the good cannabinoids. So take the scissors and you trim off the bud, drop the stalk and all that to the ground, and you're holding the bud. That is a form of processing. And guess what? That bud is likely to have more than 0.3% Delta-9 THC. Certainly with respect to percentages, the THC level, along with all the other cannabinoid percentages, have gone up, because this is where the cannabinoids are. All of this heavy material, by and large, does not have meaningful concentrations of those cannabinoids. So that one step alone, in the DEA's eyes, could render that product and that one act as being as turning it from illegal to illegal. And then, of course, that's not how processing typically goes, particularly for consumer products. You send them in and they're ground down to biomass, and then they go through ethanol or CO2 or hydrocarbon extractions, and sometimes isolations, and there's all these waste stream products and everything else. And all of that continues to exacerbate this problem by ramping up the percentage of THC without actually adding to the quantity of THC. And the position that I have, most of my colleagues have, is that the DEA is misinterpreting the law and refusing to lose its grip on the cannabis plant, where Congress clearly intended for extracts to be lawful. So again, I'll stop there. You ask a lawyer question and we'll talk for forever. But that is the problem in a nutshell. Right. And it's a problem that I think is profound for the industry.
Yeah, I think that was a great illustration. I don't think I've ever thought about it that way. And it's one of those things where but maybe you just don't put it in a certain context of just taking that bud and just taking away all the other stuff that doesn't. So you're concentrating it essentially for
You're
the
concentrating
cannabinoids,
it.
and and then that continues further when you're actually processing, like you're saying, with ethanol or CO2 or any other method. Funny enough, I saw a post on Facebook on one of the I forget what it's called, Farmer Connections or something like that, hemp farmers, someone looking for 6 to 8% CBD biomass, like 2,000 pounds or something like that. So I think people are trying to figure out if there's a way that they can process without going past that 0.3% at any stage.
Right.
Which is challenging because it's possible. I've been talking with my chemist about this. It's possible, but then the amount of work that you have to do to get that is so much more. So you're then increasing the cost and decreasing the yield. So who will be able to afford to do that?
Yeah, it makes things just much more difficult. The USDA and Congress are clearly trying to advance hemp and the cannabinoids from hemp. We've got some, the FDA is not being helpful. That's a whole different podcast and conversation. And now we've got the DEA that's really coming in and putting the brakes on things. It's crazy and it's difficult. And certainly there is, you can look at this from several different lenses. One lens is to say, well, once that hemp plant has been deemed hemp and lawful, then anything flowing from it is legal. And that's a very viable and coherent position. But even if we step back from that and this whole work in progress hemp, which is what I discussed in my article, you think, okay, well, if you've got the inputs, you've got the hemp itself, the biomass is lawful, and you've got the output, maybe the consumer product, say, that's lawful, no more than 0.3%. The process that it goes through, even if that spikes, that's a often necessary, but even to your point, even if it's not absolutely necessary, it's certainly not cost effective usually, to keep all that below 0.3%. The DEA should be focused on diversion of illegal compounds to the public, and clearly that's not what's happening in the hemp industry. So it makes it really difficult. And there are a couple of different ways that this plays out. So one way is that, as I said, you have the lawful input and the lawful output. In the meantime, there's somewhere in the machinery, just to kind of be general about it, there's a spike. That's one way it plays out. Another way it plays out is that, say you have a processor that just focuses on, say, producing crude or some other distillate, and so the legal inputs come in, it produces a crude or a distillate that's hemp, but it might be 3, 5, 8% THC, which is not what the marijuana market's looking for. I mean, someone who's actually looking for a marijuana oil is not looking for a 5%, thing.
Yeah.
But then that may be sold to another processor for further refinement. The third way that it plays out and affects processors is in the isolation process, where you're actually coming in and you're isolating different cannabinoids, and in particular, maybe you're remediating the THC, which is just, technical term for just removing the THC. Well, then that processor is certainly putting out CBD isolate or some sort of THC-free distillate, but then they're in possession of this waste stream THC. And what do you do with that? It's in maybe 55 gallon drums, and what that processor is doing is actually removing the THC from what goes out to the public, but then they're holding on to this hemp derived THC, and that creates a problem as well. So there are a lot of different ways that this plays out in processors, but none of which are good when you look at it through the lens of the DEA.
Yeah, and that was that last point. We had a lot of conversation here at the office about that, and so we can put in a solution that will make that unusable. But still, at some point, even if for a few minutes or a few hours, we have Delta-9, right?
Right, exactly. Even if it takes 5 seconds to render it unusable, for 5 seconds, according to the DEA, you're in possession of illegal marijuana. That's crazy, right? I mean, that's not what Congress intended. That's not practical. And most of my clients, well, all of my clients, I can't speak for the industry at large, but I interact with people in the hemp industry all day long, every day, and trying to pull out THC to divert it to the public is just not what's happening. People are wanting to do the right thing and create, stay within the regulations and create compliant products.
Yeah. So I am certainly not an attorney. My personal opinion, and if anybody listening or watching, you should just go talk to Rod. Don't listen to me. Is that this is a I think something to be concerned of in the future. I don't know if I'm necessarily concerned about this just yet, about this whole work in process.
Yeah. So,
THC.
I think that that's a really good point. So we talk about we talk about a lot of things. So you talk about, okay, what does the statute say and what's a reasonable interpretation? And then you say, okay, well, what does the DEA say? And we disagree with the DEA's position, but it is the DEA's position. And, but then we talk about what is the likelihood that the DEA will enforce this position. And we can see a lot of different things. We can see the DEA coming in and trying to use a lot of resources to do a raid on a processing facility. I don't think that's a high likelihood of happening. In fact, there was an article, I think at the LA Weekly or the LA Times, and I apologize, I don't recall where there was an interview with a DEA agent, spokesperson, about this very issue. And the DEA said, we understand and recognize that this is causing a lot of concern in the CBD industry, but we've got, they didn't use this phrase, but essentially bigger fish to fry. We've got an opioid epidemic. And so that what that signals is that the DEA is not going to be raiding or otherwise interested in these processing facilities. So I do think from a risk standpoint, it's not very likely that the DEA would do this, because most facilities, maybe even all of them, would at some point, in their processing, be non-compliant. Is the DEA really going to go after every processing facility in the country? No, there's no way it could do that, and there's no reason it should.
Right. All right. So not personally concerned about that, speaking personally. This next one, I think this is more of a concern. So with regarding, if you can explain this part about synthetic cannabinoids, even if they're hemp derived, and you also in the article talked a lot about Delta-8 and how it relates to what the DEA is saying, that even these synthetic cannabinoids, they're also deemed illegal. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, sure. So the other part of the IFR, the interim final rule the DEA issued, so it just sort of reiterated the point that synthetic THC is and always has been illegal. And with that just being the beginning and end of it, I don't think anyone disagrees with. The problem is that it's my personal belief and the belief of a lot of my colleagues that what the DEA was actually doing was, in a sort of roundabout way, referring to Delta-8 THC. And for the listeners that don't know, Delta-8 THC is one of the analogs of THC. There are about 30 different forms of THC. The one that is called out in the hemp, in the Farm Bill with respect to hemp, is Delta-9 THC. But there are all sorts of other forms of THC. And so, if we think about Delta-8, well, by the way, it's a big product now. It kind of went from being no one had ever heard of it to right now people love it and it's everywhere, and people are making tons of money on it. And it does have a psychoactive effect. It's about 2/3 of what Delta-9 THC is, but in other words, it can get you high. So with that as the background, it's absolutely clear that if you were to, pluck Delta-8, off of the plant, so to speak, that's lawful. You don't pluck cannabinoids off the plant, of course, but to say if the plant expressed Delta-8 in meaningful quantities and you were able to pull it out and sell that, there's no question that would be lawful. The issue becomes in how Delta-8 is actually produced in the market, and it's usually produced through some sort of a process. I've heard it being produced by heat. I've heard it being produced by converting other hemp-derived cannabinoids, notably CBD, to Delta-8. And the question becomes, does that process of taking one cannabinoid and doing some sort of chemical process to end up with Delta-8, does that mean that it's synthetic? And you would think that this would be a simple question to answer, but in fact, the case law and rules and regulations going back for decades is actually fairly opaque on this issue. And so again, if we start at this point over here, that plucking a Delta-8 cannabinoid from the tree is clearly lawful. At what point, if any, does it become synthetic and therefore a Schedule I illegal controlled substance? My position is, I have a couple different positions. One is that the mere conversion of CBD, for instance, to, well, let's start with heat. I'm not sure how this works. It's a fairly new process I've heard about. Let's say you take a cannabinoid and you heat it and it turns into Delta-8. You're not doing it. You're not adding chemicals to it. You're not doing anything. You're heating it. And that happens naturally. We talk about THCA through heat and time will decarboxylate into Delta-9, and no one considers that a synthetic conversion. So I think, my layman's in terms of chemistry opinion is that heating it, if that in fact works, is not synthetic. The next piece would be, okay, well, we'll take CBD. So you take hemp-derived CBD and you convert it by taking a chemical catalyst into Delta-8. Well, again, Delta-8 is a natural product of hemp. It's not come in large quantities, but is a natural product of hemp. The CBD not only was hemp-derived, but according to the statute, is itself hemp, because hemp is defined as the plant and all of its cannabinoids, isomers, derivatives. So CBD from hemp is, in fact, from a legal standpoint, hemp, and a derivative of hemp is lawful. And so that is just a derivative of hemp. And so that's okay. And then if you start looking at what synthesis actually means, it typically involves creating something that's other than what it originally was in a big way. So like there's a lot of ways to produce cannabinoids through yeast. So you're taking a yeast and turning that into a cannabinoid, that's clearly a synthetic. But where along the spectrum would this be considered an illegal form of THC due to the fact that it's synthetic? My position is that converting CBD, heating it, whatever, is not a synthetic, and it's possible that the DEA agrees. To be clear, my concern is that the DEA does not agree. And if the DEA does not agree, then someone is going to end up in court on the other side of the courtroom from the DEA, where the DEA says you're producing synthetic THC, and that person's going to have to prove to the court that they're not. And we don't know what the ultimate answer to that question would be. And that therein lies the risk. And there's been a lot of, I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot. This is just a big issue. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
And there's been, I wrote this article and there's been a lot of confusion about it, because I wrote the article and I said, my position is this is not a synthetic form of THC. However, the DEA contends that it is. And then I have people arguing with me saying it's not synthetic. And I agree with you. It's not synthetic. But the point is that we don't know what the DEA thinks. And the biggest indicator that the DEA was singling out Delta-8 to me is the fact that in the context of writing a rule about hemp, why in the world is it talking about synthetic THC? That's a whole different issue entirely, unless there is a form of THC from hemp out there that the DEA contends is illegal and falls within that category. And the newest, coolest thing on the market is Delta-8. And so you put those pieces together, and I believe the DEA was singling that out. Hopefully I'm wrong, but we'll find that out. There is it's likely that we'll see a lawsuit about this issue. I'll just leave it at that. And we'll flesh all this out. But that's a big concern for the industry, and it's a very complicated one, but there's a lot riding on it.
Yeah, and I would say if anyone wants to understand more about those points that you're making, you go into great detail about the Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, how Delta-8, or I guess these so-called synthetic cannabinoids, relate to the Controlled Substances Act, as well as the, what's the AA, I've read my notes. You mentioned I just lost it, but it was the Analog Act.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let's talk about the Analog Act real fast, and I promise I'll be quicker on this one. But the Analog Act was enacted by Congress several years ago to kind of keep up with the fact that the Controlled Substances Act lists all these different substances and where they fall on the schedules, but there are these sort of designer or synthetic drugs that mimic or the effects of other drugs that are on the Controlled Substances Act. So you have drug A. That's Schedule 1 control that gets people high. That's illegal. Well, you have, a high-tech lab will say, well, we're going to create something that's similar that does the same thing, but it's not actually this drug. So, hey, so it's not on the Controlled Substances Act, so it's lawful. And there's no way for lawmakers to keep up with that. The science just always moves faster. And so the Analog Act was created to capture that, those types of compounds. And it says, well, if it's similar in structure to the listed substance and similar in effect, well, then it's also a controlled substance. And so I've gotten a lot of people reach out and say, well, yeah, well, Delta-8 may not be listed, but 8 clearly falls within the Analog Act. Well, that's wrong for a couple of reasons. One is that the Farm Bill overrides that. It says specifically that hemp and its cannabinoids are not controlled substances. So the Analog Act does not come in to then render those actually illegal again. So the Farm Bill overrides. The second piece is that Delta-8 THC does not have a similar effect to Delta-9. In fact, the clinical studies show that it has a reduced effect, particularly with respect to being psychoactive. So get a lot of emails about the Analog Act. It's my very strong position that the Analog Act does not apply to Delta-8.
And in that article, you also link to one of those studies showing how, I don't know if it was like one man specifically, or maybe several people who were given Delta-8, and how they determined that it was, I believe it was like 2/3 as potent as Delta-9. So it was,
exactly.
It did not have the same effect as Delta-9.
Yeah, and I can attest to that personally. Not that anecdotal evidence from an attorney necessarily proves the scientific point, but I've used Delta-8 on a number of occasions. I'm trying out different clients' products, and it does have a psychoactive effect, very noticeable, but it's also much less than Delta-9 or marijuana. The study that you referenced, we were talking before the podcast about how you're really focused on health and wellness, and I think Delta-8 is being marketed certainly as a sort of a legal high, and that's understandable. But also the study that was referenced had to do with children who were undergoing chemotherapy treatments, who were given Delta-8 to help them with the nausea and vomiting. And not only did it not harm those kids, but all 100%. Now this is a clinical study. How often is there 100% efficacy? But 100% of those kids were aided substantially with their nausea. In other words, it helped them to get through the chemotherapy. It helped them to not be vomiting all the time. So Delta-8 has some real medicinal qualities. It is a legit and valuable cannabinoid, aside from the fact that it can get you high.
Yeah, and I have not tried that myself, but I've read countless stories of people talking about helping them with overcoming opioid addiction and alcoholism, just anxiety, and all sorts of things, and not necessarily to the level of wanting to get high just to get high. Like there will always be that person, right? But I think that it's one of those things that has become available to folks, and what they interpret now to be legal. Right now we're talking about that interpretation, but just that it's really helped people. And not to get on a soapbox, but then you start getting into that, like, well, why is that? Because of the argument about alcohol and tobacco, right? But it just seems like, just going back to history, looking at how drug enforcement came to be in this country, and there's a lot of not necessarily logical reasons for implementing, specifically with marijuana. We don't have to go into that, but it's just such a complicated
of why. And also on the point of the psychoactive effects and getting high, I think there's a misunderstanding out there that any products or compounds that get you high are necessarily or should be illegal, but that's not the case. Kratom is a natural product that has psychoactive effects that's not listed on the Controlled Substances Act. And then what even is the definition of being high? I drink several cups of coffee every morning, and that caffeine
it's intoxicating.
It's intoxicating from being the morning grump to being someone who can actually have a coherent phone conversation, and I feel great. So what does it even mean to be high? And that's almost a philosophical question that we don't need to go into. But to be clear, whether or not a compound has a psychoactive effect has no bearing on whether it is illegal or on the Controlled Substances list.
Yeah, you can get high from meditation, from breathing.
I can attest to that as well. Yes.
All right. So then, on the third point, can we talk about the hemp pilot program? So I had a couple of clients mention this, I believe 2-ish weeks ago, that they were told by North Carolina that they have to harvest by October the 30th, because the hemp pilot program in North Carolina was going to be expiring. It doesn't seem like the state is going to be introducing a pilot program or any kind of in-state solution, and that folks will have to go to the USDA directly, which opens up a whole can of worms. Do you still have time? Are you still good on time?
I'm good on time. Absolutely. Okay. This is an important subject.
Yeah. So can you expand on that? Like, what are you hearing from folks?
Yeah. So the issue for the viewer out there is that a lot of states, including North Carolina, are operating under the 2014 Farm Bill pilot program. So 2014 legalized hemp, industrial hemp to be specific, when a state enacts a pilot program that allows farmers to grow industrial hemp. Well, in the meantime, the 2018 Farm Bill came into play, which expanded the definition of hemp, removed the term industrial, and said, well, that the USDA is going to govern hemp production unless a state proposes a plan that's approved by the USDA to regulate hemp within its borders. And so a lot of states, North Carolina included, have not issued or created a plan even for USDA approval. And so the 2014 Farm Bill and its pilot programs will sunset as of the end of October, meaning that they will be done. That's it. The law is no longer valid. And so at that point, the 2018 Farm Bill comes into full bloom, to use an agricultural metaphor, and the states that have their programs approved, those farmers will just go by that plan. States that don't have a plan approved, such as North Carolina, will suddenly and immediately be under the jurisdiction of the USDA. And the question is, where does that leave farmers? We talked about earlier in the hemp extract piece. Well, what if you've got some high THC extract for 1 hour, and then you render it unusable? Well, for that 1 hour, are you out of compliance? Well, it's kind of the same thing. You've got a hemp farmer who is completely in compliance with North Carolina or whatever state he or she's in laws under the 2014 pilot program, and then bam, the sunset occurs. Or even if they apply to the USDA and it only takes a week, and that's a made up time frame, I don't have off the top of my head how long that takes. Well, then are they out of compliance for that week before they're under the USDA? How does that process happen? And so there's all these practical pieces of shifting so immediately from one program to another. And to be clear, there have been a lot of calls. I read something even this morning in the email for the USDA to extend the 2014 pilot programs because of COVID and everything else, so that farmers don't find themselves in this position. By the way, I use a lot of hand motions, as you can see.
Right.
But the point being that this is really an abrupt change, and we don't know how it's going to play out. Nobody knows, and we're hoping that sometime within the next month or so, the USDA will give some guidance on that. Ideally, the USDA would just kick the ball down the road a little bit and allow these farmers to continue to grow under the 2014 plans, to allow states such as North Carolina who have not submitted plans to either submit a plan, or if a state's not going to, and there are good and bad reasons to submit a plan and not to create a protocol for this winding down process of the 2014 plan. So it's a tough time right now. A lot of unanswered questions.
Yeah, and it seems like there are a lot of possible scenarios if the state does not continue with the pilot program. One being that if you have to harvest by the end of October, not everybody last year, previous years, not everyone was able to finish at that point, right? That could be a huge issue. And then the other ones are, I read an article from Marnie Kight. She's I believe you know her. She's an attorney.
I know Marnie. Yeah, she's an excellent attorney and a teacher in the ag program at NC State.
Yeah, and so she mentioned some of the key standouts if we go to being under the USDA. Is that one, like you mentioned, farmers would have to get a license through USDA. What does that entail? What are the costs? Can you quickly shift over or not? Many farmers are concerned about not being able to grow indoor. Right, that's been a huge thing.
Well, right. Here. You think, well, even if I got my crop harvested by middle of October, I'm great. And we don't plant until the spring. Well, then there's plenty of time to get a USDA license. But right, what if you're growing indoor and you're on a 6-week cycle? Bam, 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 bam.
Right.
And the other thing is, you can't right now. The USDA will not allow, as I understand, you to sort of preemptively apply for a license. If a North Carolina farmer were to apply right now, the USDA would say, well, you're still under the 2014 Farm Bill provisions for your state. We can't issue a license. And so there's almost literally no way to stay in compliance, even if for a day or a week or a month, So it's a difficult.
Of course, it's impossible. The government is not one to act within a matter of a couple of hours, right? Like, oh, everybody will get a license today if you apply today.
In the best of times, it's not right. Exactly.
Yeah. And so she also mentioned, Marnie in her article mentioned that testing Delta-9 specifically to farmers, that if the Delta-9 is hot, that they have to test within 15 days of harvest, which last year that they only tested about 55% of crops in the state. So the USDA federally, how are they going to do better? And what happens to the people that they don't test?
Exactly. Well, this issue has multiple facets, and I won't get into the nitty gritty, but right. So what happens if a state does not have the resources to test all the crops, or otherwise chooses not to, and you've just got a crop? What do you do? At what point do you just harvest and say, okay, well, I'm harvested, and I'm, so that's an issue. For states that submit a plan, part of the plan, and there's a whole list of requirements for a plan to be approved by the USDA, is that the state has the financial resources to implement the plan. And this is a hang up for Georgia, because Georgia submitted a plan, and the plan did not show that it had the financial resources allocated to administer the program. And the USDA couldn't approve the plan. I think that that's been remedied, although I don't off the top of my head know the details there. But so that's an issue as well. And then of course, if the state doesn't submit a plan, and then farmers are operating directly under the USDA, does the USDA have the resources, and what's its plan? So a lot of different issues with no clear answers.
So the world is blowing up. It's 2020. Hemp is not spared. So we're wrapping up here because I know you have to go soon. But I know you're a professional, you're an attorney, but I don't know if you said this yourself or maybe just by interpretation, but you are an advocate for the industry. What would you ask people to do right now? People that are in this industry, what should we do?
Yeah, I think it's really important for people who are in the industry to reach out to their legislators and regulators to inform and educate, because I think by and large, hemp is one of those things that it's not a blue or a red issue. It's something that conservatives and liberals and Republicans and Democrats all really like. It's kind of the great uniter. And so, but what's the problem is that I think, legislators and lawmakers of all stripes don't know that these problems exist. They think, oh, well, yes, rah hemp, we passed a bill, great. Or that bill's coming up on the next legislative session, we'll deal with it, or whatever. And these are urgent, sometimes complex problems. And so you reach out to your state level lawmakers, your federal level lawmakers, and to the House and Senate, and also to regulators, the North Carolina Department of Agriculture, or the Department of Agriculture of whatever state you operate in, and also the USDA. It's important. And when enough people are saying, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, then it starts to get heard. Otherwise, you're not heard, and the ship begins to sink just because the captain didn't know that there was a hole in the hole. That's probably a bad analogy. That was right off the top of my head, but you get the point. I think sure. Education, and particularly education for the people in power who pass laws and propose and promulgate regulations, is key right now. So get on your computers, get on your phones, and reach out.
Yeah, good. And I would encourage folks to read your articles. I'll post them in the show notes. I'm sure we can use that or some of that logical reasoning as to why the DEA should stay out of this, and to try to get maybe North Carolina to continue the pilot program. Whatever you believe about the issue, I think that it's important to even if you are somewhat emotional, I think that when I've seen folks comment with really negative language towards lawmakers, or just like rambling all over the place, that doesn't seem to really make a positive impact on lawmakers reading these things. They might say like, oh, well, this is just some wacko, like let's not pay attention to this person. But I think using some sound reasoning as to here's the issue, and here's why we believe that it should be this way or that way. I think those are important things to keep in mind, right? Instead of just throwing out a bunch of curse words.
You're exactly right, Jason. Well, think about it. I mean, if you use the I don't know if it's the power of empathy, but the power of putting yourself in someone else's place. Yeah. And so you're a lawmaker, and you've got all sorts of things going on, and people pinging you about everything. And someone says, hey, this thing about hemp is BS. And it can be a lot more flowery than that, as you've probably seen. That lawmaker is going to say, oh, this is some Yahoo, whatever. Whereas if you say, hi, I'm a farmer in your jurisdiction, or a processor or a retailer, and I am, my livelihood depends on this, and it's helped my family members or my customers, and this is the problem that I see, and this is what we think is a fix. In other words, to your exact point, a logical flow, and make it personal, because I think that lawmakers are impacted, just like we all are as humans, about personal stories that make sense. Oh, here's a good law-abiding person within my jurisdiction or precinct or whatever, and they're trying to do it right, and they're facing a problem. This is a real problem. It needs to be solved. Versus, oh, to hell with all those people at the federal government. That just doesn't do anything.
Right. Yeah. Awesome. Well, Rod, we'll leave it there, and since you have to run, thank you so much for educating, for doing what you do, and I hope that a lot of people take action after they listen to this.
Yeah, thanks. It's always great talking with you. I appreciate all of your good questions and insights and all the good work you're doing.
Thanks, Rod. Talk to you soon.
Hey guys, and before you go, this is Jason from Spectrum Labs. Please be sure to visit us on the web at thespectrumlabs.com for any show notes and links discussed in the podcast. Also, remember to click the subscribe button wherever you may be listening from so you get notified when our next episode comes out. And tune in next show and have a fantastic day.